So that's sort of what I've been doing. Any questions on that? How are we going? Pretty good. I don't think we've got Wong, so I think Wong might have had a few potential dramas happening with the Bears today. I'm sorry for those of you that have come specifically to talk to Wong. He's not obviously here, but if he does arrive by the time Tyron has finished his talk about bats, then we might pivot and come back to Wong at the end. All right, so I would like to then introduce you to Tyron. So Tyron, are you going to run your own slides? Are you happy doing that?
Yeah, I reckon I can manage that. We'll find out soon enough, I suppose.
Yeah, here we go. So Tyron is going to talk to us about managing human and wildlife conflict using bats as his primary sort of indicator of that. But I'll pass over to Tyron, and thank you so much for being here. So appreciate it.
Not a problem at all, Sarah. Thank you very much. I'll just start to share this and let's see how clever I am. And let's see if we can go this. Here we go. Sharing. Beautiful. We under control here?
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you. Fantastic. That's a great start. Thank you very much. Look, I'm coming here from Kabi and Yinnaburra land on the beautiful Sunshine Coast. So firstly, I'd like to pay my acknowledgement, my deepest acknowledgement to our First Nations people of Kabi and Yinnaburra land, and also anyone else across the world who might be of First Nations descent. Very much paying my respect and my acknowledgement to the ongoing knowledge and the care and continuing care for country. We're here talking about conservation more broadly. These people were doing conservation in Australia for millennia. There's tens of thousands of years worth of knowledge, and they've shared that through their generations, and also are fortunate enough to share it with us as well. So I deeply hope that I can continue these partnerships with our First Nations people on the Sunshine Coast, and also more broadly to continue that understanding of conservation and caring for our country. Now, I wouldn't be able to sort of talk to you about flying foxes and conflict management without giving you a quick crash course on flying foxes. So for those who aren't aware of flying foxes, I'm going to kind of go between terms here a little bit. So all flying foxes are fruit bats. They're bats that eat fruit. Pretty straightforward. They're also bats. Now, I will also sometimes mention other bats, which are the little smaller echolocating bats that feed on insects, but primarily I'm talking about the fruit bats, these really large ones, and they are quite large. Their torso is about as big as me. They weigh about 1 kilo, and their wingspan can be up to 1.5 meters sometimes, so they are incredibly big. And in Australia, over 1/4 of all native mammals are bats, which I just find incredible because you only kind of concentrate on a few of them, but they're actually really prolific. They're placental mammals just like us, so they give birth same way as we do. Placenta comes out, and they typically only give birth to one individual every year in a really good year. And it takes females about 3 years to get to sexual maturity. So, you know, it does take a bit of time. And even though we see them in large congregations sometimes, people often go, oh, geez, they're in plague proportions. They're everywhere. They must be going out of control. That's not the case. They're actually quite slow in terms of their reproductive cycle. And in the wild here in Australia, due to all the threats, some of them are only living to about 7 or 8 years old. So there's not much fecundity, as we would say, in terms of trying to proliferate their population. And they're the only mammal capable of sustained flight, which is really impressive. Dogs don't fly, cats don't fly, whales don't fly, pigs don't fly, but these guys do. They're capable of moving massive distances, thousands of kilometers across the landscape, all the time spreading seeds and pollinating as they go. Incredible distances. We do in Australia have some marsupials, and we have some other mammals like gliders and things like that, you know, they're falling with style, as Woody from Toy Story would say. They're not constantly flying everywhere. So these ones are actually able to lift, take flight, and as mammals, that's incredibly energy dense. Like think about you going every single day and flapping your little arms around to try and get yourself to move from one place to another all day, every day, which is why they're constantly having to have these high energy resources like flowers and nectar. Now, they are from the order of Chiroptera. And as ecologists, we're fairly straightforward folk. We see things and we name them as we see them. So here's a hand that's evolved over 23 million years to become a wing. It's a hand wing. We'll call them chiropter. Fairly straightforward stuff. So as you can see with these ones, this is actually their 5 digits on here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor if I move it over here, but this little dude up here, that's its thumb. So just like ours, that's its thumb. They actually use it for a lot of things. It's not just for show. So the males will actually do this when they're boxing each other for territory. They'll have little thumb wars. They get their little thumbs out and have a little wrestle with one another. They also use that as a very, very important job, which is to invert. So when they go to the bathroom, one of the questions I always get asked is, how do they not get mess all over themselves? And it's pretty simple. They've actually got great core strength. So they're hanging upside down, as we would see them. They do themselves a little ab crunch, get themselves up, hook on with their thumbs, let go with their feet, swing back down, do their business, give a little bum shake, making sure all's clean, crunch themselves back up, and away they go. So it has a really important function. But those other digits that we can see, those other 4 that we've got, they're actually very important in terms of how they move. So how they're moving their wrists, they're moving their fingers, they're quite fancy things. So they're just doing jazz hands. That's how they get through the landscape. They're constantly flapping, flipping their fingers, and that's how they're moving through complex ecosystems and through rainforests and just generally flutter feeding as well for some of those microbat species. And the little one that you see at the bottom there, the lovely female there, it's a grey-headed flying fox. Again, we're not very creative. It's a flying fox. It's got a grey head. It's called a grey-headed flying fox. That little girl there, she's actually got a bub on her that you can see as well. So the bubs actually hang onto mum's chest, and she has a teat underneath her armpit. So they'll have a little suckle on the teat underneath the armpit, which you won't be able to see in that photo. But they're just cruising around nonstop with a bub attached to them. And these ones are actually listed as nationally vulnerable to extinction in Australia. So these little critters, they're actually really impressive and they're very important in terms of pollination. So whilst they do get a pretty bad rap sometimes, they have a very important purpose in terms of pollination and seed dispersal. So they're our primary nocturnal pollinators. So they're doing all their busy work at night. They're our FIFO workers. They're out busily flying from here to there, spreading seeds, pollinating forests as they go, whilst we're asleep. So we don't necessarily get to see all their good work. And because they're so large, they pollinate more plants and over a larger distance than birds or insects. With over 600, just think about that number there, 600 species of Australian plants and animals rely on their pollination skills for survival. And over that 23 million years of coevolution, many of our Australian species have actually co-evolved with them to attract flying foxes specifically. So our eucalypt forests, they've actually evolved so they have sort of creamy coloured or white or yellowy coloured flowers, so they're easier to see at night. And they actually, about 90% of their pollination is done by flying foxes for some of these species. And they actually open up their stamens and only let nectar out at night. And again, it's to try and attract flying foxes. So it's this synergy that they have within the landscape, knowing that this is the best way to connect those large fragmented spaces of forest that we have across Australia, is to attract these large fauna and flying foxes to try and connect it. Before the commercial agriculture industry as well, we had bananas solely pollinated by flying foxes and bats, which is, again, a remarkable issue that I wouldn't have had brekkie this morning if we didn't have flying foxes. Cacao, so we wouldn't have chocky either, one of my big food groups. And most importantly, the blue agave is solely pollinated by a small insectivorous bat. So without bats, we would have no blue agave, which means we would have no tequila, no Friday nights, no good times. And that is just absolutely criminal that we couldn't do without bats for. So very, very important roles that they play rather. So how does it actually work? Well, great question. I'm happy to answer that for you. Now, bats fly around at night. As I said, so we've got this beautiful little bat here flying from place to place. She's going into that plant there to have a bit of a feed. You can see in that bottom picture there, that's actually a grey-headed flying fox. So she's supposed to be a grey colour, but she is beautifully yellow because she has just dived face deep into that golden pender, and all of the pollen is stuck to her face, all over her chest, all over her belly, and it's just sticking to that fur so strongly. She then flies to the next flower. And this is a before and after photo of the same individual, believe it or not. She's then happily just cruising around that next golden panda, having a feed, covered in stamen. She's having the time of her life. And so every time they're moving around the landscape, they are constantly cross-pollinating. And they're doing that sometimes up to 50 or 60 kilometers every single night, and dozens of different plants that they're going and cross-pollinating between. Now, they're our little nature's caravanners, as I like to refer to them. Now, I'll press this map to start going in a second. And before I do that, I'll just explain this was actually a tracking project done by the University of Western Sydney. So they actually put cute little collars, little tracking collars on 201 flying foxes, and they tracked them for up to 5 years. And sometimes some of them went over 5 years. And each of these dots that you'll see moving around a second is one single flying fox. So you get to see how far they actually move when they're flying. So look at how far they're going. Now, it's easy to think when we go to a site and we see tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of flying foxes in a space, that's where they are. That's where they live. They come back there, they fly out at night, and then they come back to the exact same spot. But that's not the case. They're acting like kind of backpacker hostels, if you will, and they're constantly moving between the landscape. So think of this like an airport, if you will, where if you went into a busy international airport, if I was a bat and I went in there and I looked around and went, oh my goodness, there's a plague of people here. Look at them. There's thousands of people. They're everywhere. They're as far as the eye can see. They're noisy. They're smelly. Get rid of them all. And then I go away and I come back into the next day and I look in the same airport and I go, oh my goodness, look, there's thousands of them still. They're all the same. They're still noisy. They're still smelly. Let's get rid of them. But the reality is when you look at that same place, a lot of the people have turned over. They're itinerant. They're going and coming. This is just a node where they're going from. And there's realistically only a small number of people who are staying at that airport, the people that work there. It's similar to flying foxes. So they have a lot of these little nodes up and down the east coast of Australia and across into South Australia as well, where they're constantly moving in between, and they're always responding to either climatic conditions or to flowering patterns. But they are moving extremely large distances during that time. So to illustrate that point a bit better, here is the National Flying Fox Monitoring Program. So the reason why I chose back in 2018 was because this was before our Black Summer bushfires. So that was a large series of bushfires that devastated a lot of the country and moved through New South Wales and Victoria and basically removed about 30% of their feeding habitat. So obviously they've had to pivot a little bit. They've had to kind of change what they do since 2019, but because they're capable of flying such large distances, they've adapted fairly well, which is great. So as you can see here, the different times of year between May and between November, between their mating season and between their birthing season, this is for grey-headed flying foxes, their range has changed dramatically. And the darker the area there means the higher the concentration of animals. So this obviously correlates to different types of plants being in flower at the time. So during May, it's a lot of our lovely paperbark trees, a larger range. They're spreading themselves around, lots of things to feed on as a grey-headed flying fox. And then during those, just getting into summer then, the range is really restricted because it's a different flowering pattern as well, and different species are flowering at the same time. So they've changed and adapted to their needs. At the same token, to give a far more dramatic example of it, here are the little red flying foxes. Now, these ones are capable of flying exceptional distances, and they come in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even up to 2 million almost overnight in some instances. So they are extremely large populations. They move en masse, and they're incredibly nomadic. So during that same time period, they've got a flipped ecology. So their birthing seasons opposite essentially to the grey-headed flying foxes. Their birthing season, they were spread out a little bit more throughout Queensland, a bit throughout central Queensland as well. But then you can see them concentrated into like 4 or 5 sites exclusively during November that same year. So a really restricted range. And again, it's because there's peak flowering, they've got their preferred food. So for these guys, it's usually bloodwoods flowering, and they have honed in on a spot and gone, this is exactly where all the bloodwoods are flowering. This is exactly where we're going to go. We're going to hit them, and they're only going to be here for a couple of months, and then they take off to move to another place. So really tricky because they're constantly moving. Now, I've kind of gone on about the importance of flying foxes and their ecological role and how important they are in pollination, but why do we manage human-wildlife conflict then? And obviously for people who aren't from Australia, they might not have this same sort of perspective and see the same sort of issues that we have here. Now, these are animals that are largely doing their business at night. They can sometimes be quite disruptive in terms of, having a bit of a chatter or a fight or otherwise just fighting for territory as they're pollinating during the night and having a feed. But when they come back during the day, it's typically when they're at their most impactful. So these guys are coming back at dawn, sometimes a little bit before it. So in southeast Queensland, right at the moment, it's about 4:30 in the morning that they're flying back in en masse to a new roost site. And that's when they're battling for territory as well. The boys are boxing each other. They're trying to search for mates. So there's a lot of stuff happening in a space early on in the morning, which can be quite disruptful. These are also really, really serious issues. So I'm certainly not here because I get dozens of requests every single day from my community saying how impactful it is. So I'd be naive in saying that there weren't any issues or that they were minor, because they are really significant to some people. And the noise being certainly one of them. And odor, they do a lot of scent marking this time of year as well. So it is quite a pungent aroma, but it's kind of like, how some people can taste coriander and some people say it tastes awful and some people say it tastes lovely. It's the same sort of thing where there's sort of individual nuance with odor, that some people are really, really responsive to it and really sensitive to it. People like myself, very fortunate, don't really smell it at all. Probably wouldn't have lasted long in the industry if I was against it. So I'm perk of the trade, let's say. So for some people, it's really impactful. This has led to really serious issues. So things like lack of sleep, especially for people who do shift work, breakdowns in relationships, suicidal ideologies, people trying to live in their cars to get away from the noise and the smell. So really legitimate concerns here. And so we are actually in a space where we're trying to balance conservation outcomes for a threatened species with really severe and quite serious social impacts. So it's a really nuanced space and it's really complex. So how do we navigate that? Now, on top of this, a lot of people have what's called a narrative of fear. So flying foxes, yes, they've been deeply ingrained in this sort of narrative for hundreds of years. So things like Dracula, the portrayal of vampires, those sorts of things really haven't helped, where people should be fearful of bats and fearful of the night. And there's all this mystery and they're awful, evil creatures. So a lot of that fear has subconsciously been planted in. And I'm not an epigeneticist, so I'm going to speak very vaguely on epigenetics, but there is a thing called social learning theory, where this has actually been shown that passing on these experiences through your sort of nature versus nurture situation here, through your social interactions, has actually led to a fundamental change in the DNA of offspring. So those intergenerational and transgenerational traumas and fears have been passed on through generations, which means that, that negative impact and that really heavily ingrained narrative of fear through our parents and our grandparents and generations previous has kind of solidified over time. And as we know, when people are, conversing and people are learning through their conspecifics and their parents, etc., they learn through observation. And when they see these fears come out from other people, they inherently become fearful of it. And in terms of this social behavior or social learning theory, mental states are really important to learning. And this is something you've probably seen in your education as well, is that you have to kind of feel it. You have to be in a good place to be able to take on new information, and just learning facts and figures is not necessarily going to lead to any sort of behavior change, which is a little bit counterintuitive. And obviously me coming up here and just talking lovely facts about flying foxes is also a little bit counterintuitive, because you might not necessarily be in the space that you want to learn more about them. And that's often what happens with some of these residents that are really heavily impacted. They don't want to hear how important they are. They just want to know, how are you going to help me, Tyron? So how do we shift that narrative? Well, as a wise woman once told me, my lovely gran, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. Nothing's ever going to change. And we've been trying to scare away flying foxes for 120 years and it hasn't worked. We've been bashing pots and pans, firecrackers, lighting fires underneath them, all sorts of things to try and get rid of them. And it's never worked. So yeah, we can come up with some of these new solutions. There's lots of lovely new solutions that I'll kind of touch on here as well. Very, lovely ways of going about it. But if we're looking at it the same way and we're looking at this same problem and all these new solutions aren't working, perhaps it's not the solutions that are the problem. Perhaps the problem's the problem. And to that, I mean, perhaps we're not asking the right questions or we're not framing it in the right way. So how do we move from this narrative where bats equal bad? Bats are bad, they're awful, my goodness, you should be fearful of them. Oh, okay, in that case, I'm going to tell you how good they are, how important they are, and then you're just inherently going to love them. And if it doesn't work, well, then I just need to tell you more, and eventually I'll bash you over the head with the facts, and you'll see the same thing as me. That's not necessarily how it works. So how do we change this narrative to instead be that coexistence is really tricky? Now, inherently, that then reframes it as well, because it's sort of both parties have a shared interest in this and they both have a shared responsibility in trying to manage this. That, yeah, it can be tricky and those things are noisy and smelly sometimes, but there's something I can do about it on my side as well. I'm part of this management process. I'm empowered. I have agency to be able to change my mind about this. And sometimes it is tricky like in any relationship, sometimes you don't get along all the time. So how do we do that? Well, firstly, we educate people and try and engage with them. So this is that learning part that I mentioned at the beginning. So we do that we have our monthly monitoring. So all those in that second photo there, those lovely dots on the map, we actually have staff members that go out every single month and monitor each roost. So the very first photo that you can see is the footprint. So you can actually go in and we count every single animal that's there ideally, and all the information's there. You can see exactly what's happening and get a landscape picture of how dynamic they are, where they're moving across the space, within the space, across the region, across the country, to get a better understanding of how dynamic this species is. Have our sort of standard things like your board games and your interp signage and our beautiful mascot, Frankie the Flying Fox as well, that goes out to lovely events and helps spread the word of flying foxes as well. But I did say that speaking facts doesn't necessarily lead to behavior change because you've got to be in that mental state for it. So here's how we then change that a little bit as well and try and go into spaces where people are already comfortable or bring them to a space where they're going to be more comfortable to try and take on those new messages. So things like our Teacher's Guide, which is our education program. So that's basically empowering all of our teachers with units of study. So things that they can do to learn about flying foxes that's curriculum aligned. So they can actually thread it through their learnings and their teachings to the students about how important flying foxes are at different age groups and in different subjects. I have an audio tool, so for people who can't get to a site or if they want to have less of an ecological footprint, you can download that app, listen to some beautiful sounds of a flying fox roost and learn some facts about flying foxes as well. Our hands-on tours as well, so guided tours with ecologists, with First Nations partners to actually, there's nothing better than connecting with them and seeing them in person to learn to protect them. And get that beautiful connection and ask all the questions with the experts. And then our Bat Pod, which is our Choose Your Own Adventure podcast. So like the old Goosebumps books, if you ever had those, we'd go up to a point and go, oh, do I want to go left or right? Flick through pages. Oh, yeah, page 13. Oh, sorry, you fell down a hole. I'm going to go back and try that again. Same sort of scenario, but a novel concept with a podcast where you're actually in my role for the day, going alongside with me, and you get to make the decisions on how you would manage a situation with an urban flying fox roost. Now, we just sprinkle in a little bit of innovation with that as well. So these things are those sort of value adds. They're those solutions, those things that I said that might be really lovely and novel ways to approach it. So that sprinkler that you see there, the humble sprinkler, in this instance, it's actually used as a deterrent. So it's something that we give as an option to some residents that are right next to a flying fox roost and actually empowers them. So it's your average off-the-shelf field sprinkler that you'd see at your school ovals, you know, sort of ones. But we've installed it up in the canopy. And what it does, it only operates for about 30 to 45 seconds, and it goes on a couple of times during the day, and it shoots out that jet of water. And the water itself doesn't impact the flying foxes. You know, they're outside every single day. They're out in storms, they're out in cyclones. They couldn't care less about being wet. But what it does do is that short period of time that it's on, it's hitting the leaves, it's hitting the branches, it's making a rustle, it's making a sound, and it's replicating something moving really quickly through the canopy. So it would be, you know, like a carpet python or a goanna or something coming up from underneath to try and grab a flying fox. And what they do in response is they actually just lift themselves up because they're so clever and because they're able to do it, fly back about 20 meters and re-perch themselves in and settle their roost down a little bit further away from people. So we're not trying to get rid of them from the landscape because it would be naive in thinking that we could, because we can't. They move. They're wild animals. They do whatever they please, unfortunately, sometimes. But that's how they work. But trying to empower people to be able to have a bit of a deterrent and a bit of a power to try and shuffle them back just a little bit further. Now, top one that we've got there is our odor neutralizing trial. So it's something that was such a fun little trial and something that I'll never forget being a part of. So that beautiful big machine there that you've got, there's a little container next to it. There's a little liquid in it. And what that liquid does, it vaporizes in that machine and goes through those two black tubes that you can see up the top. So it's just corrugated plastic tubing, but it's got little holes in the bottom of it. And when it's been vaporized, it's like a big vaporizer that you'd have at home if you have, you know, have a cold or a flu or a dehumidifier. And it just ekes that treatment. And what that liquid was, it was actually specially formulated at a lab. And they actually identified the odor molecules of flying foxes and flying foxes alone. And it grabs onto those odor molecules and neutralizes them. So it's not going to work if there's ibis or if there's rubbish or if there's sewage or whatever else, but it will neutralize the flying fox odor. So it's something, again, that empowers these people because obviously they said noise and smell are really impactful things. It's not really a lot we can do about stopping smell in an open landscape. So maybe there's something that we can do to try and neutralize those odors on people's properties. So this was a really interesting one because I got to partner with people who were professional sniffers. I didn't even realize that was a job before now. They actually went there with a big vacuum bag and caught some buckets of air. And they'd be there like a sommelier. So they're sitting there and then, oh yes, this is a lovely Sunshine Coast air pocket. Yeah, it's a 96 white. You know, they actually smelled the components and went, oh no, this is really impactful, or no, the odor is being neutralized. And so they were actually able to identify that the odor was being neutralized, which is just incredible things that we can be trialing here. But I appreciate my time is running out, so I won't labor on these any further. I'm happy to address questions as well. But if you wanted to see any of those resources a bit closer, feel free, snap a QR code. You're welcome to go and have a look at them, grab any of those resources. These are things that are all publicly available because the intention of this is that everything I do is publicly available so we can have that conversation around, is this being done well or not? And for those who are in Australia, please feel free to be involved. Submit a sighting on Bats in Backyards. So it's iNaturalist, which is an app that a lot of you might be using already. What we're wanting to find out is what flying foxes are feeding on so that we know both what we can plant to encourage them to go to places, but also if you don't want them in your backyard, what do you avoid planting? And I empower you. Be the voice in the community. Spread the word, share the resources, spread the little facts, because the reality is I'm just some random guy from the council. And if people have questions and they want to grill someone, they're not necessarily going to listen to me. But those Sunday barbecues that you have, those different social outings when someone pops up a thing, oh my goodness, those bats, they're awful, aren't they? Hopefully you have a little bit of information now that I've imparted on you that you can just sprinkle through again, and you've been equipped to try and have those conversations, and slowly we can shift that narrative. They're never going to go from 0 to 100, but maybe we can kind of shift that narrative. And feel free, be part of the conversation. Feel free to leave some feedback as well. I do have 3 very short questions in terms of how we can do flying fox management better. And I'd love to always harness information and opinions from other people around the world as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate all of your time and appreciate Sarah for inviting me along. Thank you.
Wow, that was fabulous. Thank you so much, Tyron. I just that was even better than I'd have ever imagined. So thank you so much. I'm going to put us back to the gallery and ask the questions. But while you're thinking about your questions, guys, I want to a couple of things that I made notes of while you were talking. And I think the most important thing is the innovation that you're using, Tyron, is using all sorts of different innovations to handle this human wildlife conflict. And that conflict doesn't just happen with bats. That conflict happens around the world with all sorts of different species, doesn't it? So I know, like in Borneo, we've got conflicts with bears, we've got conflicts with elephants, you've got, you know, all around the world there's conflicts. And just that concept of being innovative and coming up with ideas of ways that we can live better together, whether it be bats or something else, I think is just a mind shift, really. And it's a mind shift that we need everywhere. So thank you so much. Even though there's many of our people here aren't in Australia and they might not see a flying fox for a while, it's appropriate for every single ecology, I think, in the world. Thank you, Tyron, so much for being here. Thank you, everybody else. We'll see you soon.
Thank you kindly.